If you answer the question my son died asking me, you keep the $6. The words landed heavier than the rain pounding against the glass windows of Whitmore's Steakhouse in downtown Chicago. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Ice clinked softly inside crystal glasses. Even the piano player in the corner missed a note. Edward Whitmore sat alone at the center booth beneath a gold chandelier that looked expensive enough to pay someone's rent for a year. 62 years old. Silver hair combed perfectly back. Navy cashmere coat folded beside him. A watch on his wrist worth more than most cars parked outside. The kind of man people recognized without introduction. Billionaire investor. Real estate giant. The man financial channels called the architect of modern Chicago. But tonight, Edward Whitmore did not look powerful. He looked tired. The kind of tired money cannot fix. Across from him stood Naomi Carter, holding a tray with 2 untouched bourbon glasses balanced carefully in one hand. 26. Black waitress. Soft brown eyes. Calm posture. Hair tied neatly behind her head. The kind of woman rich people looked through instead of at. She had been working the dinner shift for 9 straight hours already. Her feet ached. Her shoulders burned. But she still carried herself with quiet dignity, the kind built from surviving hard years without letting them turn you bitter. "Sir?" she asked gently, unsure if she heard him correctly. Edward slid a wrinkled $6 bill across the white tablecloth with 2 fingers. "Answer the question," he repeated, "and it's yours." A few businessmen sitting nearby chuckled under their breath. One of them muttered, $6? Man's testing waitresses like game show contestants now. Another smirked without even lowering his voice. Pretty sure she'd rather have a tip. Naomi heard them. She heard everything. Years in restaurants taught her that wealthy people often mistook service workers for furniture. Invisible until needed. Disposable after. But Edward didn't laugh with them. He just stared at Naomi with hollow gray eyes that looked like they had not slept peacefully in years. There was something strange about the $6 bill. It was folded carefully, worn at the edges. Old enough to matter. Naomi glanced at it, then back at him. "What's the question?" she asked quietly. Somewhere behind her, a server dropped a fork into a tray. The sharp metallic clink echoed across the room. Rain rolled down the windows in thick rivers, turning the city lights outside into blurred gold streaks. Edward leaned back slowly in the leather booth. "My son asked me something before he died," he said. I never answered him. The entire table near the window went silent now. No more smirking. No more whispers. Because grief has a sound when it enters a room. And everyone hears it. Edward looked down at the bourbon glass near his hand, but never touched it. "Every year on this date," he continued softly, "I ask someone the same question." He paused, long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Nobody's ever answered it right. Naomi swallowed carefully. Not because she was nervous. Because suddenly this no longer felt like a joke. She set the tray down beside the booth. "What did he ask you?" she said. Edward finally looked directly into her eyes. For the first time all night, he actually saw her. Not the uniform. Not the tray. Not the role. Her. Then he spoke the question that had haunted him for 11 years. "What's something people only understand," he said quietly, "when it's too late?" The question lingered over the restaurant like smoke that refused to clear. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a drink. Outside, thunder rolled across the Chicago skyline, low and distant, while rain hammered against the windows hard enough to blur the city into streaks of silver and gold. Naomi stood still beside the booth, one hand resting lightly against the serving tray near her hip. She had heard difficult questions before. Life had asked her plenty, but something about the way Edward Whitmore said those words felt different. Not like a challenge. Like regret. Around the dining room, people pretended not to listen while listening to every syllable. A couple near the bar stopped eating entirely. The bartender paused midway through drying a glass. Even the piano player softened his music until the notes barely floated above a whisper. Edward watched Naomi carefully now, studying her face the way investors studied risk. Waiting for hesitation. Waiting for another shallow answer that would disappoint him the way the world had disappointed him for over a decade. Naomi glanced down at the old $6 bill again. Folded. Faded. Protected like something sacred. Suddenly she understood. This was never about money. Edward rubbed his thumb slowly along the edge of his untouched glass. "Most people answer with things like success," he said quietly. "Or love. Or time. His voice carried no arrogance anymore, only exhaustion. My son hated those answers. Naomi said nothing yet. She could feel every eye in the room shifting toward her, waiting for the waitress to fail gracefully so dinner could continue and everyone could return to pretending they were not witnessing something deeply human unfold between strangers. But Naomi Carter knew what it felt like to lose things too early. Her mother used to say grief changes the temperature of a room, makes everything colder even when people are smiling. Naomi understood that now. Edward leaned back slightly in the booth, the leather creaking softly beneath him. He was 19, he said after a long silence. Smartest person I ever knew. His jaw tightened. And the only person in my life who never cared about my money. Naomi noticed something then. Edward Whitmore never once called him my late son, never used polished words. Because real grief does not sound polished. It sounds unfinished. One of the businessmen near the window shifted awkwardly and checked his watch, clearly uncomfortable now that the conversation had become too real for entertainment. Earlier, those same men had smirked at Naomi like she belonged in the background. Now they looked away from her completely. Funny how quickly people stop laughing when pain enters the room. Naomi finally pulled out the empty chair across from Edward slowly, careful, respectful. A nearby manager immediately stiffened. Naomi, he whispered sharply from across the dining room. Do not sit with the guests. But Edward raised one hand without even looking back. The manager froze instantly. Billionaires do not repeat themselves. Naomi sat carefully at the edge of the chair. Not relaxed, not entitled, just present. Her hands folded calmly in her lap. Edward studied her for another moment beneath the warm amber light hanging above the booth. So, he said softly, what is something people only understand when it is too late? Naomi looked toward the rain sliding down the windows. For a second, she thought about hospital rooms that smelled like antiseptic and coffee, about overdue bills stacked on kitchen counters, about her mother pretending to smile through exhaustion because she did not want her daughter carrying fear on top of responsibility. Then Naomi looked back at Edward Whitmore and answered in a voice so quiet the entire restaurant leaned closer to hear it. That being needed, she said gently, matters more than being admired. The room went completely silent. Not awkward silence. Not curious silence. The kind of silence that arrives when truth enters a place too small to hold it. The silence after Naomi's answer felt alive. Heavy. Breathing. Somewhere near the kitchen, a plate slipped from someone's nervous hands and shattered against the floor, but nobody turned to look. Every eye remained fixed on booth 12 where Edward Whitmore sat motionless beneath the chandelier, staring at the young waitress across from him as if she had just opened a locked room inside his chest. Naomi did not smile after answering. She did not look proud of herself. That was the strange part. Most people, after impressing a billionaire in a room full of wealthy strangers, would have chased the moment, leaned into it. But Naomi simply sat there calmly with tired eyes and folded hands, like someone who understood that truth was not performance. Edward's jaw tightened slightly. He looked away from her for the first time since she spoke and toward the rain sliding down the tall windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. His reflection looked older tonight. Smaller somehow. That is what he said, Edward whispered finally. A woman near the bar covered her mouth softly. One of the businessmen who had laughed earlier lowered his eyes to the tablecloth, suddenly fascinated by nothing at all. Naomi blinked carefully. Your son? She asked gently. Edward nodded once. Slow. Controlled. But grief always leaks through the cracks eventually. 3 weeks before he died, Edward said quietly. He told me I spent my entire life trying to be admired by people who would replace me before my funeral flowers wilted. The words settled hard across the room. Cold. Honest. Edward let out a dry laugh, without humor. I told him admiration was how the world works. He paused again. He told me I was confusing respect with usefulness. Naomi listened without interrupting. Because sometimes people do not need advice. Sometimes they just need someone willing to stay long enough to hear the pain all the way through. Edward loosened his tie slightly for the first time all evening. His name was Daniel, he said. He hated charity galas, hated private jets, said rich people spent too much time applauding each other for pretending to care. A faint smile almost touched Edward's face before disappearing again. Smart kid. Naomi noticed his hand trembling slightly beside the bourbon glass now. Tiny, barely visible. But enough. The kind of shaking people get when memory arrives stronger than pride. What happened to him? She asked softly. Edward closed his eyes for one brief second. The piano in the corner stopped entirely now. No music. Only rain. Cancer, he answered. The word came out flat and exhausted, like something repeated too many times over too many years. By the time they found it, there was not much anybody could do. Naomi lowered her gaze quietly. She knew hospitals too. New fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning. New vending machine dinners and doctors speaking gently, because harsh truth sounded cruel after midnight. Edward reached slowly into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out an old folded photograph worn soft at the corners. He slid it across the table toward Naomi. A young white man around 19 smiled back from the picture, sitting cross-legged on a rooftop somewhere in summer sunlight. Messy blonde hair, thin from treatment, but still smiling. Really smiling. The kind that reaches the eyes. That was Daniel 6 months before he passed, Edward said quietly. Naomi studied the photo carefully. There was something warm in Daniel's face that did not exist in Edward's anymore. He looks kind, she said. Edward swallowed once. Hard. He was. Another silence filled the restaurant, softer this time. Sadder. Then Edward looked directly at Naomi again, his gray eyes shining faintly beneath the amber light overhead. Do you know why your answer scares me? He asked. Naomi shook her head slightly. Edward leaned back slowly and looked around the restaurant full of expensive suits, polished watches, and people suddenly pretending not to eavesdrop. Because for 11 years, he said quietly, you are the first person who answered like someone who actually loved another human being. Naomi did not know what to say after that. The restaurant around them suddenly felt smaller, quieter, like the walls themselves were listening. Outside, the storm continued swallowing the city block by block, headlights smearing through rainwater like liquid gold across the glass. Edward Whitmore sat with the old photograph still resting between them on the tablecloth, his fingers lightly touching the corner as though letting go of it completely might mean losing his son all over again. Naomi looked down at Daniel's smiling face one more time before carefully sliding the photograph back toward Edward. He sounds like someone who saw people clearly, she said softly. Edward let out another faint laugh, tired and uneven. That was his problem, he replied. He saw too much. A waiter hurried past the booth carrying steaks toward another table, but even the usual restaurant noise felt distant now. The laughter from the private dining room had faded. The clinking glasses sounded softer. People were still pretending not to watch booth 12, but human curiosity is stronger than manners most nights, especially when grief and money sit at the same table. Naomi reached for the water glass beside her chair, suddenly aware her throat had gone dry. My mother used to say something similar, she admitted quietly. Edward looked up immediately. Did she? Naomi nodded once. She cleaned rooms at a hotel on the south side for almost 20 years. Her voice remained calm, but memory softened it around the edges. Every night, she came home exhausted, feet swollen, hands cracked from chemicals. Naomi smiled faintly to herself. But whenever I apologized for needing help with school or bills or anything else, she would always say, Baby, being needed means you still matter to somebody. Edward stared at her without blinking now. Not because the words were dramatic, because they were honest. Real wisdom rarely sounds expensive. That is why powerful people miss it so often. Naomi looked down at her own hands resting in her lap. When she got sick, people treated her differently. She continued softly. Friends stopped calling. Co-workers disappeared. Even family got uncomfortable. Her eyes drifted toward the rain-covered windows. But the people who truly loved her stayed. Edward's expression shifted slightly then. Less guarded. Less corporate. Like a man slowly remembering how to listen instead of control. And you stayed too, he said quietly. Naomi nodded. I left school during my junior year. A businessman at the nearby table glanced over again, surprised now. Perhaps because he had spent the first half of the evening assuming the young black waitress could not possibly have belonged in a college classroom. Naomi noticed his look immediately. Years of being underestimated had sharpened her instincts. But she ignored him. I thought I would go back after she recovered, she said gently. But life does not always return what it borrows. Edward lowered his eyes for a moment. He understood that sentence too well. Naomi leaned back slightly in the chair. The strange thing is, she added, I do not regret taking care of her. Her voice grew quieter, softer. Those were the hardest years of my life, but they were also the years I mattered most to someone. Another silence settled over the booth then, different from before, not painful this time, human. Edward slowly removed his glasses and rubbed at his eyes with one hand, careful, discreet, like a man unaccustomed to emotion arriving in public places. Across the restaurant, nobody laughed. Anymore, nobody whispered, because somewhere between the expensive wine and the polished silverware, the room had stopped watching a billionaire entertain himself and started witnessing two strangers mourning the same invisible thing. Edward placed the glasses back on slowly and looked directly at Naomi again. "Do you know what scares me most?" he asked quietly. Naomi shook her head once. Edward glanced around the crowded restaurant filled with people who admired him, feared him, envied him. Then he looked back at the waitress sitting across from him beneath the chandelier glow. "I spent 40 years building rooms full of people impressed by me," he said softly. "And somehow tonight, the only person who made me feel less alone is the woman they expected me not to notice." Edward Whitmore had spent most of his life believing silence meant control. In boardrooms, silence made people nervous. During negotiations, silence made people reveal too much. In interviews, silence made him appear powerful. But tonight, sitting across from Naomi Carter beneath the amber restaurant lights, silence felt different. Tonight it felt honest. He stared at the young waitress for several long seconds after speaking, his tired gray eyes studying her like a man searching for proof that goodness still existed somewhere outside memory. Naomi looked down briefly, uncomfortable with how many strangers were now openly watching them. She could feel it in the room. The shift. Earlier, she had been invisible. Another black waitress carrying trays through a luxury steakhouse where wealthy people treated service workers like moving furniture. Now those same people watched her carefully, almost cautiously, as if intelligence sounded different coming from someone they had already decided not to value. A woman in pearls near the bar whispered something to her husband while glancing toward Naomi. Two younger men in tailored suits looked embarrassed suddenly, their earlier smirks gone completely. Funny how quickly arrogance collapses once humanity enters the conversation. Edward noticed it too. "You know what the worst part of success is?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked back at him. He gave a faint shrug. "People stopped speaking honestly around you." Rain continued sliding down the windows behind him in silver streams. Downtown Chicago glowed beyond the glass like another universe built from money and ambition. "They tell you what keeps them close to power," Edward continued, "not what is real." Naomi listened carefully while a server nervously refreshed nearby water glasses no one intended to drink. "Daniel used to hate that," Edward said softly. He said wealth turns conversations into performances. His fingers tapped once against the old $6 bill still resting on the table between them. "He told me one time that he could walk into a room and immediately tell who wanted something from me and who actually cared whether I was human." Naomi's expression softened. "Was he right?" she asked gently. Edward looked around the restaurant slowly. Crystal glasses, expensive watches, perfect smiles. The kind of room he had owned for decades without ever truly belonging to. Almost every time, he admitted quietly. A long breath escaped him then, heavy and tired. When Daniel got sick, the calls stopped being about him. His voice lowered further now. They became about my company, my schedule, my public image. Investors asking whether I would still attend conferences while my son was dying in a hospital bed. The words landed like stones in water. Quiet. Brutal. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. There are some pains people recognize immediately because life has already introduced them before. Edward rubbed his palms together slowly, staring at nothing for a moment. One night Daniel looked at me and asked if I even knew who I was without business cards and headlines. A faint smile touched his face again, sad this time. I told him that was a ridiculous question. Naomi tilted her head slightly. And now? Edward looked directly at her. Now I think it terrified me because I did not have an answer. Somewhere behind them, thunder rolled across the city again, deep enough to rattle the windows faintly. Naomi noticed the photograph of Daniel still sitting beside Edward's hand. Young, thin, smiling anyway. My mother used to say people reveal themselves by how they treat workers, Naomi said softly. Edward raised an eyebrow slightly. How so? Naomi glanced around the restaurant carefully before answering. Because kindness to powerful people proves nothing. The sentence hit the table harder than anyone expected. A man at the neighboring booth slowly lowered his wine glass. Even the bartender stopped moving again. Naomi continued calmly, never raising her voice. But kindness to someone who cannot improve your status? She shook her head gently. That shows character. Edward stared at her for several long seconds after that. Then something unexpected happened. The billionaire who had once terrified corporate rivals and controlled billion-dollar mergers suddenly smiled. Small, real, human. Not the polished smile from magazine covers. Not the cold one investors trusted. This one looked almost unfamiliar on his face. Daniel would have liked you, he said quietly. Naomi's eyes softened with surprise. Edward glanced down at the $6 bill one more time before speaking again in a voice barely above a whisper. And that might be the first compliment I have meant in years. For the first time that night, Edward Whitmore forgot to look at his phone. It rested face down beside the empty bourbon glass, screen dark, silent, ignored. That alone would have shocked most people in Chicago. Men had built careers waiting for Edward to answer their calls. Politicians adjusted schedules around his availability. Financial networks interrupted broadcasts when he made statements. But now the billionaire sat quietly in a restaurant booth listening to a waitress speak about kindness like it was something rare enough to protect. Outside, the storm had softened into steady rain. Water streamed down the windows in slow silver lines while traffic crawled through downtown streets below. Inside the steakhouse, the dinner crowd had changed completely. Earlier the room buzzed with loud conversations and expensive laughter. Now voices stayed low, careful, almost respectful. Because somewhere during the last hour, Booth 12 had stopped feeling like entertainment and started feeling sacred. Naomi noticed her manager hovering nervously near the kitchen entrance again. His eyes kept darting toward Edward, clearly terrified the restaurant's most powerful customer might somehow be offended by all this. Funny thing about fear. It makes people misunderstand silence. Edward finally reached for the $6 bill again, unfolding it carefully this time. Naomi noticed faded blue ink on the corner now. Handwriting. Small. Uneven. Daniel wrote on it, she asked softly. Edward nodded without looking up. His thumb traced the faded ink gently, like someone touching memory itself. It was the last cash he ever carried. Naomi stayed quiet. Edward swallowed once before continuing. We stopped at a gas station outside Milwaukee after one of his treatments. His voice slowed slightly, drifting backward through time. He bought coffee and a lottery ticket with this bill. A faint smile touched his mouth again. Said maybe the universe owed him a break. Naomi could almost picture it. A thin 19-year-old boy joking inside fluorescent gas station lighting while his exhausted father tried, pretending hope still felt easy. Edward stared at the bill another moment before turning it over slowly. Naomi leaned forward slightly. Written in faded ink across the corner were 4 words. Be useful to someone. The sentence sat there quietly between them. Small, simple, devastating. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. Not because the words were dramatic. Because they sounded like the kind of advice someone gives when they know time matters now. Edward folded the bill carefully again. That became his thing near the end, he admitted softly. He stopped talking about achievements. Rain tapped gently against the glass behind him now, softer than before. He just wanted people to matter to each other. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Most people do, she said quietly. They just forget once life gets busy. Edward looked at her carefully then. How old were you when your mother passed? Naomi hesitated for the first time all evening. Just slightly. 23. Edward nodded slowly, as if recognizing something in her answer beyond the number itself. That is young. Naomi gave a small shrug, but grief always lives. Somewhere visible if you know where to look. Cancer too, she admitted quietly. The words settled heavily between them. Different people, different neighborhoods, different lives. Same hospital smell, same sleepless nights, same helpless waiting beside machines that could measure heartbeats, but not save futures. Edward leaned back slowly in the booth. Funny, is it not? He murmured. The world spends so much time dividing people by money and status. His tired eyes drifted toward the crowded restaurant. But suffering does not care about tax brackets. Naomi looked at him carefully. For the first time all evening, he no longer resembled the billionaire from magazine covers hanging in airport bookstores. He looked like every exhausted son who had ever sat beside a hospital bed praying for more time. My mother used to say grief reveals who people really are, Naomi said softly. Edward raised an eyebrow slightly. How? Naomi glanced toward the dining room, where wealthy strangers now watched them with expressions somewhere between curiosity and shame. Because when life breaks your heart, she said gently, you stop pretending shallow things matter. Edward went completely still after that. Then very slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded, like a man finally hearing the truth in a language he understood. The rain finally stopped just after 10:30, but nobody inside Whitmore Steakhouse seemed eager to leave. The city outside glistened beneath streetlights and passing taxis, wet sidewalks reflecting gold and white like broken mirrors. Inside the restaurant, dinner plates sat half-finished. Wine glasses remained untouched. Conversations had dissolved into scattered whispers because the entire room still felt suspended around booth 12. Edward Whitmore looked down at Daniel's old $6 bill resting between his fingers, turning it carefully beneath the warm chandelier light. The faded words written across it seemed heavier now somehow. Be useful to someone. Naomi watched him quietly from across the booth, noticing how different he looked from the man who first walked into the restaurant hours earlier. The sharpness was still there, the expensive suit, the posture built by decades of authority, but grief had softened the edges. Or maybe honesty had. Sometimes those two things arrive together. Edward slipped the folded bill slowly back into his coat pocket. Do you know what my board wanted after Daniel died? He asked suddenly. Naomi shook her head once. Edward let out a dry breath through his nose. They wanted me back at work within 10 days. A nearby couple glanced toward him immediately. Edward noticed, but kept talking anyway. One investor actually told me grief was understandable, but markets preferred stability. His expression darkened slightly, as if burying your son should fit neatly into a quarterly earnings report. Naomi felt her stomach tighten at the sentence. Not because it shocked her, because she believed him instantly. Wealthy people often learned how to discuss tragedy without ever touching emotion. Did you go back? She asked softly. Edward stared toward the skyline beyond the windows. The next morning, Naomi blinked slowly. Edward nodded once, bitter amusement touching his mouth. I spent 40 years teaching people that productivity mattered more than pain. His tired eyes drifted toward her again. Then life tested whether I actually believed it. Silence settled between them briefly while a server quietly lit another candle near the hostess stand. The restaurant felt dimmer now, softer, like even the building itself understood something important was happening inside it tonight. And did you? Naomi asked gently. Edward gave a faint shake of his head. No, the answer came immediately this time. Honest. Certain. I just did not know how to stop. Naomi understood that too. Some people survive by staying busy enough to outrun grief. Until one quiet moment finally catches them. Edward leaned forward slightly in the booth. Daniel used to volunteer at a community center on the west side. A small smile returned to his face, warmer now. Drove me crazy. Naomi tilted her head. Why? Because every time I tried introducing him to investors or executives, he disappeared to tutor kids in math instead. Edward actually chuckled softly this time. Real laughter. Human laughter. He told me. Teaching somebody who needed help felt more important than networking with people who already had everything. Naomi smiled faintly. Sounds like him and your son understood something most people miss. Edward's expression softened again. He used to say the loneliest people in America are often the richest because nobody around them risks telling the truth anymore. The sentence hung in the air for several seconds. Across the dining room, a young busboy quietly wiped tables while glancing toward booth 12 every few moments. Naomi noticed him immediately. Teenager. Nervous posture. Probably working nights to help his family. The kind of person wealthy customers rarely remembered existed after dinner ended. She watched him struggle carrying a heavy tray stacked with dishes. Without thinking, she stood halfway from her seat. Excuse me 1 second, she said softly to Edward. She crossed the dining room quickly and helped steady the tray before the young worker dropped it. You are okay, she told him gently. Slow down. Nobody is racing you. The boy looked startled someone noticed him at all. Thank you, he whispered quietly. Naomi smiled once and returned to the booth. Edward had watched the entire thing without speaking. The moment she sat back down, he asked softly, Do you do that often? Naomi looked confused. What? Edward glanced toward the young busboy, now working more calmly across the restaurant. See people everybody else ignores. Naomi hesitated slightly before answering. I know what it feels like when nobody does. Edward stared at her for a long moment after that. Then slowly, almost painfully, he nodded to himself, like a man finally understanding why his son would have admired this woman long before he ever did. By 11:15, the restaurant had nearly emptied, but booth 12 still glowed beneath the chandelier like the center of something unfinished. Staff moved quieter now, instinctively careful around the strange gravity that had settled over Edward Whitmore and Naomi Carter. Outside, the storm clouds had broken apart completely, leaving downtown Chicago slick with reflected city light. Yellow taxis rolled past rain-dark sidewalks. Steam drifted from street grates into the cold night air. Inside the steakhouse, the smell of coffee replaced the earlier scent of grilled steak and bourbon. Naomi glanced at the clock near the bar and realized she should have ended her shift almost an hour ago. Strange thing was, she no longer felt tired. Edward sat silently for several moments after watching her help the young busboy. His expression had changed again. Softer now, more reflective, like someone slowly realizing that character reveals itself most clearly in moments nobody expects applause for. Finally he spoke. Daniel used to do things like that. Naomi looked back toward him. Edward nodded toward the busboy across the room. Seeing people. His voice lowered slightly. One Christmas he disappeared during a charity gala at our house. A faint smile crossed his face again. Half the guests thought he was being rude. Naomi leaned forward slightly, listening. I found him in the kitchen eating leftovers with the catering staff. Edward shook his head softly to himself. Said it was the only honest conversation he had all night. Naomi smiled before she could stop herself. I think I would have liked him too. Edward looked at her carefully after that sentence. Not as a billionaire evaluating someone. Not even as a grieving father anymore. Just as a human being recognizing another one. Then something unexpected happened. He reached into his coat pocket and removed his phone at last. Naomi noticed several people nearby glance over instantly. Even now, power pulled attention automatically. Edward ignored them completely. He scrolled briefly through his contacts before pressing one number. Harold, he said when the line connected. His voice returned calm and firm now, but different than before. Clearer somehow. I need you to cancel tomorrow morning's board breakfast. A pause. Edward listened without expression. No, it cannot wait. Another pause. Then Edward looked directly at Naomi while speaking his next words. Because I am done pretending my life still makes sense the way it is. Naomi blinked softly, caught off guard by the sentence. Edward continued listening for several seconds before speaking again. Also call Martin and Eleanor. I want my attorneys at the penthouse at 8 tomorrow morning. This time, even the bartender stopped pretending not to eavesdrop. Attorneys. At midnight. In Edward Whitmore's world, that usually meant billion-dollar decisions. No, Edward said quietly into the phone. Not next week. Tomorrow. His eyes drifted toward Daniel's old photograph, still resting beside the empty bourbon glass. Something important finally became clear tonight. Then he ended the call. Naomi stared at him carefully across the booth. You are changing something, she said softly. It was not really a question. Edward looked down at his hands for a moment before answering. For 11 years I kept telling myself I honored Daniel by preserving everything I built. He gave a faint shake of his head. But the truth is, I built a world he never actually believed in. Naomi stayed quiet. Sometimes people only admit the truth once they are ready to survive hearing it aloud. Edward glanced around the restaurant slowly. Expensive artwork. Marble floors. Men in tailored suits discussing investments and acquisitions like human worth could be measured in percentages. Daniel did not care about inheritance, Edward murmured. He cared about impact. His tired gray eyes returned to Naomi again. And tonight a waitress making $14 an hour reminded me of that better than every executive surrounding me for the last decade. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, uncomfortable with praise that felt too large for her uniform. I did not do anything special, she said quietly. Edward almost smiled again. That is exactly why it mattered. Silence settled over the booth once more, softer than before. Peaceful somehow. Then Edward slowly reached into his coat pocket one final time and pulled out the folded $6 bill again. But this time, instead of sliding it across the table like a challenge, He placed it gently into Naomi's hand. "Keep it," he said quietly. Naomi looked up immediately. "Sir, I cannot take something that belonged to your son." Edward closed her fingers carefully around the old bill. His voice nearly broke when he answered. "I think," he whispered, "he would have wanted you to." The last guests left Whitmore's steakhouse a little after midnight. Chairs were turned upside down onto empty tables. The piano sat silent beneath dimmed lights. Outside, Chicago breathed cold and quiet after the storm, steam rising from rain-soaked streets while distant sirens echoed somewhere beyond the river. Naomi stood near the front entrance, fastening her coat slowly, still holding the folded $6 bill carefully inside her apron pocket, like something fragile enough to disappear if touched too roughly. Across the restaurant, Edward Whitmore remained seated alone at booth 12 long after everyone else had gone home. The old photograph of Daniel rested beside his hand. Empty coffee cups surrounded him now instead of bourbon glasses. Funny how grief changes what a person reaches for. Naomi glanced toward him one final time before preparing to leave. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. Edward looked up immediately, almost startled by the sound of her voice breaking through his thoughts. Then he stood slowly from the booth for the first time in hours. At 62, he still carried the posture of authority naturally, but tonight there was something gentler beneath it. Something human. "Naomi," he said quietly. She stopped near the entrance beneath the soft glow of the restaurant lights. Edward walked toward her carefully, coat folded over one arm, Daniel's photograph tucked safely back inside his wallet now. For several seconds, he simply looked at her without speaking, like a man trying to memorize a moment before life carried it away. "Do you know something strange?" he asked softly. Naomi shook her head. Edward glanced around the empty restaurant. "I have spent years sitting in rooms full of people trying to impress me." His tired gray eyes returned to hers. "Tonight was the first time in a very long time somebody reminded me how to become a better person instead." Naomi lowered her gaze slightly, uncomfortable with praise that sounded too heavy for ordinary words. "I think your son already knew how," she answered gently. Edward smiled then. Small, honest, the kind of smile grief usually steals. "First, maybe," he admitted quietly. "But tonight you made sure I remembered." Snow had begun falling lightly outside now, tiny white flakes drifting through the glow of downtown streetlights. Winter arriving softly over the city. Naomi opened the restaurant door halfway, cold air rushing briefly into the warm lobby. Then Edward spoke again before she could leave. "At 8 tomorrow morning," he said, "my attorneys are rewriting my will." Naomi turned back slowly, surprised. Edward slipped one hand into his coat pocket. "The scholarship foundation I promised Daniel I would create after he passed." He paused briefly. "Tomorrow it finally becomes real." Naomi blinked softly. Edward continued. "Not for elite private schools. Not for children born close to opportunity." His voice grew firmer now. "Certain. For caregivers. Working students. People who quietly carry other people through difficult lives." Naomi stared at him silently while snow drifted behind her through the open doorway. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked gently. Edward looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because the person who reminded me what mattered deserves to know the truth changed somebody tonight." Naomi felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Not because of the money, not because of the foundation, because somewhere between the rain and the grief and the old $6 bill, two strangers had managed to give each other something rarer than wealth. Understanding. Edward reached into his pocket one final time and handed Naomi a small folded note. "Daniel wrote this during his last week," he said quietly. "I think you should have it." Naomi unfolded the paper carefully beneath the restaurant lights. The handwriting was uneven but clear. "If people leave your life feeling smaller, your success means nothing." Naomi looked up slowly, emotion shining softly in her eyes now. Edward glanced toward the snowy Chicago streets beyond the glass. "He was 19 years old," he whispered, "and somehow wiser than every billionaire I have ever met." Naomi folded the note carefully beside the old $6 bill and placed both gently into her coat pocket near her heart. Then she stepped out into the cold city night while snow drifted silently around her. Edward remained standing inside the empty restaurant watching her disappear down the sidewalk beneath the streetlights. And for the first time since losing his son 11 years earlier, The billionaire did not feel like a man protecting an empire. He felt like a father finally honoring one.